America, the land of wide-open skies, rugged mountains, and endless opportunity. But hidden deep within these landscapes lies a far darker legacy. What if I told you that for more than 200 years, families across America, cut off by geography, circumstance, and tradition, have been trapped in genetic nightmares? Lives marked by deformity, illness, and silence. These aren't distant myths. They are real families, real children. Born into isolation they could never escape. From a family in West Virginia communicating only in grunts, to a Kentucky clan whose very skin turned blue. Their stories defy belief. This is not just one case, not two, but at least 10 major family lines in American history, all documented. From the coal towns of Appalachia to the Puritan founders of New England, from Texas ranches to windswept prairies. And it stretches across time. From the nation's earliest settlements to families who still live with the consequences today. And contrary to what you might think, these weren't always the uneducated or the poor. Sometimes they were America's brightest, its wealthiest, its most respected. The human cost is impossible to ignore. Children born with severe physical deformities, generations living with cognitive and social challenges, entire bloodlines marked by suffering. These cycles passed from parent to child, repeating for decades. And even now in the 21st century, some families remain locked in their shadows. But their struggles also unlocked secrets of human genetics, teaching science lessons that still save lives today. In Europe, royal bloodlines intermarried to protect power and wealth. But in America, inbreeding came from isolation. Remote hollows cut off by mountains. Religious communities guarding themselves from outsiders. Pioneers too far apart to find new partners. These were not tales of arrogance, but of entrapment. Stories hidden in silence, shame, and secrecy. Many only uncovered in recent years by courageous researchers and photographers willing to step inside these forgotten communities. Over the next hour, we'll uncover the science, the history, and the human stories of America's most inbred families. We will confront their realities with honesty, yet with dignity. And we'll reveal how modern science, medicine, and education are helping to break these tragic cycles. But first, deep in the hills of West Virginia, lies a family whose very existence raises more questions than answers. Before we dive into these shocking revelations, if you're ready to uncover America's most hidden and disturbing family secrets, hit that subscribe button right now. These are stories you won't find anywhere else. And we need your support to continue bringing these untold histories to light. Let us know in the comments which city you are watching from. The opening of our story showed us the hidden consequences of isolation in America. But nothing prepares us for the haunting reality of one family in the hills of West Virginia. A family so cut off from the outside world, their very way of communication is unlike anything most of us have ever witnessed. In a small town called West Virginia lies a family whose lives are both a mystery and a mirror of the hidden costs of isolation. What happens to a family when the only voices they know come from within their own bloodline? In the year 2000, photographer Mark Leda, working on a project about rural America, stumbled into a family that would shake him to his core, the Whitakers, a clan shielded by their community, bound by ties so close they blurred the line between kinship and survival. Leda's camera captured more than images. It captured sounds. The Whitakers often communicate not with words, but with guttural grunts, yelps, and sharp whistles. Their language, unintelligible to outsiders, was their own, and it told a story no words could. This was not a family abandoned. Neighbors in knew about them. They even protected them, driving away outsiders who came too close, shielding their secrets for decades. To them, the Whitakers were part of the town's fabric, however different. Their origins remain uncertain. Some whisper the Whitakers were once connected to a wealthy local family. Others claim they were always poor, trapped in the hollow, marrying only within their kin. Whatever the truth, generations of intermarriage etched their story into their very bodies. And yet, for all the world's judgment, they endure. In recent years, after their story broke into the national spotlight, strangers from across the globe donated money to help the Whitakers repair their home. A GoFundMe campaign raised thousands, shining light and compassion on a family long hidden in the dark. These images validated what had been whispered for generations. No longer rumors, This was documented reality. And while experts warn against sensationalism, the photographs provide a sobering window into the human cost of isolation. Scientists explain that inbreeding increases the chance of recessive genetic disorders emerging. Traits that might stay hidden for centuries suddenly rise to the surface when bloodlines overlap too closely. The Whitakers are a textbook example of what can happen when geographic isolation and generational inbreeding collide. It's not about judgment. It's about biology. The Whitakers are not just a story. They are a living reminder of what happens when isolation becomes destiny. A family caught between secrecy and survival, and a nation finally forced to look. But the Whitakers are not the only family carrying a visible mark of inbreeding. Just across the Kentucky border, another clan developed a condition so startling, it turned their very skin blue. The Whitakers' story revealed what isolation can do to a family hidden in the hills of West Virginia. But in the mountains of eastern Kentucky, isolation left its mark in a way the whole world could see, on the very skin of those who carried it. How did a family, living along a stream called Troublesome Creek, turn blue? And what can their story teach us about the hidden power of genetics? For the Fugates, their skin color became both a curse and a source of pride, a visible legacy of love, survival, and secrecy. In the early 1800s, a French immigrant named Martin Fugate settled in this remote valley. He married Elizabeth Smith, a fair-skinned American woman who carried a hidden genetic trait. Together, they unknowingly set in motion one of the most unusual family stories in American history. Generation after generation, their descendants stayed close to home. Marriage options were scarce in the hills, and cousins often married cousins. With each union, the rare genetic condition became more concentrated and more visible. The result was methemoglobinemia, a condition that reduces oxygen in the blood. Their skin turned shades of blue, from faint lavender to deep indigo. One descendant, Luna Fugate, was remembered as the bluest woman of them all. She bore 13 children and lived to be 84. Methemoglobinemia makes the blood less efficient at carrying oxygen. In rare cases, it can turn the skin a striking blue. For the Fugates, this trait persisted because the community was so isolated. Relatives intermarried, and the recessive gene had nowhere else to go. In most towns, difference leads to cruelty. But in Troublesome Creek, the Fugates were accepted. Their neighbors saw them as hard-working, ordinary people, just with unusual skin. "Would you change back?" someone once asked. A Fugate replied, "Why would I? This is who we are." To them, blue skin was not shame. It was identity. Doctors who studied the Fugates confirmed the science. The blue hue came from recessive genes shared by both Martin Fugate and Elizabeth Smith. Their children inherited a double dose, and the condition spread through generations of intermarriage. Local doctors documented cases throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. By the 1960s, medical researchers traced the condition across dozens of descendants, proving how one hidden gene can transform an entire family line. The Fugates became a living laboratory. Their story helped scientists better understand blood disorders and proved how isolation shapes genetics in America's mountains. The Fugates remind us that beauty and tragedy often walk hand in hand. From one marriage in the 1800s came a legacy of blue skin, community resilience, and scientific discovery. They lived, worked, and raised families like anyone else. Yet their very bodies carried the unmistakable mark of isolation. But not every Appalachian family carried their uniqueness so openly. For others, isolation brought consequences hidden behind closed doors, secrets that lasted generations. The Fugates wore their legacy on their skin, blue for all to see. But across the ridges and hollows of Kentucky, there were families whose genetic stories weren't so visible, and often far more tragic. What happens when isolation isn't marked by color, but by silence, deformity, and generations of hardship? These families were bound by loyalty, geography, and poverty, trapped in cycles they could not escape. In the late 1700s, settlers pushed deep into Kentucky's mountains. They built cabins along narrow creeks, far from roads or towns. Over time, clans formed, large interconnected families who relied on one another for survival. But their loyalty to blood often meant marrying within it. These children weren't born this way by choice. Their parents and grandparents followed tradition, bound to kin and cut off from the world beyond the holler. For them, deformity was not a single tragedy, but a legacy repeated across generations. Clan loyalty was everything. Outsiders weren't trusted. Marriages between cousins, even between uncles and nieces, weren't unusual. In a community this isolated, the gene pool narrowed dramatically. The mountains themselves became walls. Steep ridges, muddy roads, and swollen creeks made travel nearly impossible for much of the year. A young man might have only one or two potential brides within walking distance, and they were often his own kin. Poverty deepened the cycle. With little money, few opportunities, and no way out, families turned inward. Children were born into conditions that limited not just their health, but their futures. And yet, within these hollers, these families endured, surviving against odds that should have broken them. Government surveys from the 19th and early 20th centuries reveal entire counties where just a handful of surnames dominated. Genealogists found webs of intermarriage so tight, it was impossible to separate one clan from another. When populations shrink, recessive traits emerge. You see everything from cleft palates and skeletal deformities to neurological impairments. These weren't curses or punishments. They were predictable outcomes of closed communities. This was not unique to Appalachia. From Puritan New England to Mormon enclaves in Utah, American families faced the same risk when cut off from broader society. But here in Kentucky's mountains, the combination of geography, poverty, and tradition made the problem especially visible. The Kentucky mountain families remind us that isolation does more than separate. It shapes destiny. Entire generations bore scars of loyalty, geography, and survival. Their stories are not just tales of deformity or hardship. They are stories of endurance. Families doing the best they could in a world that gave them no way out. But what happens when isolation isn't only geographic, but enforced by religious belief? What if faith itself created a genetic prison? In Kentucky's mountains, poverty and geography trapped families in cycles of inbreeding. But in America's cities, something very different happened. Isolation wasn't born of hardship, but of privilege. What happens when the same genetic risks that plagued Appalachian hollers are embraced, deliberately, by America's scientific and social elite? Here the motivation wasn't survival, it was the belief that genius itself could be preserved in blood. Charles Darwin, the father of evolution, married his first cousin, Emma Wedgwood, in 1839. Together they had 10 children, but 3 died young, and others suffered from chronic illness. Still, the practice continued. Cousin to cousin, generation after generation. The idea crossed the Atlantic. Wealthy American families, industrialists, intellectuals, political dynasties, married within their own circles, often cousins, believing they were protecting their bloodlines and consolidating wealth. In the 19th century, cousin marriage wasn't just tolerated, it was fashionable among the elite. They saw it as a way to preserve what they called superior stock. Darwin's own theories on heredity and variation, ironically, gave some families a scientific excuse to continue the practice. In the mountains, inbreeding produced silent porches and hollow eyes. In drawing rooms lined with velvet, it produced frail children hidden from view, victims of the same genetic laws. One of Darwin's own sons wrote in his diary of constant illness, lamenting, "I am not fit for much in life." For the great thinker who reshaped our understanding of nature, the consequences of inbreeding were not abstract. They lived in his home. Darwin himself recognized the danger. In 1870, he privately lobbied for the British census to collect data on cousin marriages, worried that inbreeding could weaken families over time. His fears were not unfounded. Researchers later confirmed higher child mortality and health complications among Darwin's descendants. Genetics does not discriminate between rich and poor, whether in a coal miner's shack or a marble estate. Closing the gene pool brings out the same risks. The Darwin-Wedgwood marriages show us that isolation takes many forms. In the mountains, it was imposed by geography. Among the elite, it was chosen, justified by science, wealth, and tradition. In both cases, the result was the same: children burdened with fragile bodies, families haunted by loss. But cousin marriage among America's wealthy was still hidden in letters and estates. In rural communities, the consequences could not be hidden. They were written on every face, every body, and nowhere was this more visible than in the coal fields of West Virginia. In the grand homes of Darwin's descendants, cousin marriage was a choice born of privilege. But long before that, in America's earliest colonies, isolation wasn't a luxury. It was a doctrine. What happens when the drive for religious purity closes a community off, not just spiritually but genetically? Here, survival and faith were bound together, but the price of purity often fell on the children. When the Puritans arrived in Massachusetts Bay in the 1620s and 1630s, they were a people obsessed with keeping their faith uncontaminated. Their settlements were tight-knit, their marriages confined within the same circles. Outsiders, whether by belief or by blood, were shunned. In towns like Salem, Ipswich, and Marblehead, generations grew up with the same surnames repeated across marriage records: Putnam, Porter, Proctor. With each new union, the gene pool narrowed further. Puritan society prized conformity. Religious exclusivity often meant genetic exclusivity. Families married within their congregations. Over time, this created what we now call founder effects, where a small population passes down the same traits, both good and bad. Some children were born frail, others with developmental difficulties their parents could not explain. But in Puritan belief, such deformities were not biology. They were God's judgment. To modern science, these were predictable consequences of isolation. To the Puritans, they were evidence of sin. And in Salem, where hysteria once burned neighbors as witches, the same tangled family lines show us just how deeply isolation shaped their lives. Church and town records from Essex County reveal entire communities where a handful of surnames appear again and again. Scholars tracing these bloodlines found marriages between first cousins, uncles and nieces, and even more distant kin whose genetic ties still carried risk. When populations are this small and closed, recessive traits are far more likely to appear. Conditions like congenital deafness and metabolic disorders trace back to these founding families. These weren't isolated cases. From Connecticut to Plymouth, Puritan families created a legacy that reflected the paradox of early America, a people seeking freedom while binding themselves tighter and tighter. The New England Puritans believed they were building a city upon a hill, but in their determination to keep the world out, they carried invisible burdens within, burdens that shaped their descendants for generations. Their story reminds us that faith, fear, and family can create cages as strong as any mountain. But what happens when isolation isn't just a byproduct of belief, but demanded by it? What if religious leaders ordered their followers to marry only within the fold? In Puritan New England, faith narrowed family lines. But in some American communities, religious isolation wasn't just a byproduct of belief. It was the rule itself. What happens when devotion to God demands complete separation from the outside world and from new bloodlines? For these families, faith meant survival, identity, and tradition. But it also meant that children inherited more than just Scripture. The Amish and Mennonites, descendants of Swiss and German Anabaptists, came to Pennsylvania in the 1700s. They built communities bound by strict rules: no intermarriage with outsiders, no modern conveniences, no compromise with the world. Within just a few generations, these rules created what scientists call a genetic bottleneck. From a few dozen founding families, today's Amish population of more than 350,000 carries the same small set of genes, and with them, rare but devastating disorders. We see conditions among the Amish that are almost unheard of in the general population. Ellis-Van Creveld syndrome, which causes extra fingers and dwarfism, or maple syrup urine disease, a deadly metabolic disorder in infants. Behind the plain clothing and horse-drawn buggies are families who have buried child after child. Victims of disorders passed silently through generations of cousins marrying cousins. The story didn't end in Pennsylvania. In the 1800s, Mormon pioneers carried the same pattern west. In the deserts of Utah, isolation and polygamy created closed genetic circles. In modern fundamentalist sects, where one patriarch may have dozens of children, entire communities are descended from just a handful of men. In these communities, genetic disorders aren't just rare tragedies, they're shared destinies. Medical researchers, often invited by the Amish themselves, have documented over 200 genetic conditions tied to their population. For scientists, these communities are case studies in human heredity. For families, they are daily heartbreak. What's remarkable is how these communities endure. Many refuse outside treatment. Some embrace their children's conditions as part of God's plan. To them, modern genetics is less important than eternal salvation. From the wheat fields of Pennsylvania to the red canyons of Utah, religious isolation shaped not only how these families lived, but how their children would be born. Faith gave these families strength, but faith also bound them to genetic legacies that science is still struggling to unravel. In the name of purity, they passed down silent inheritances of suffering, proof that belief can shape blood as powerfully as geography ever did. However, far from the farms of Pennsylvania and the deserts of Utah, deep in the Texas frontier, isolation took a different form. On sprawling ranches, families turned inward for survival, creating legacies that would last for generations. From the closed worlds of Amish and Mormon sects, where faith dictated who one could marry, we now travel south and west, to the windswept plains of Texas. Here, religion wasn't the cage. Geography was. Vast distances, punishing climates, and the sheer isolation of frontier ranch life created genetic traps every bit as inescapable. But what happens when the nearest neighbor is a day's ride away, and your only options for marriage are your cousins? Or no one at all? In the mid-1800s, families like the Carter and McCulloch clans carved out their existence on sprawling Texas ranches. 1,000 acres of land might surround them, but not a single unrelated family within reach. Survival meant staying close, marrying close, and building compounds where generations lived under one roof. These children weren't the victims of neglect. They were the biological products of cycles of isolation. In some families, every branch of the family tree bent back inward. In the frontier period, the distances were staggering. You might have a family of 6 brothers, all with children, marrying each other's daughters. It wasn't seen as unusual. It was survival. But genetically, it was devastating. One recorded case from 1872 shows the Carter clan in East Texas. 5 first-cousin marriages within a single decade. Within 2 generations, children were born with clubbed feet, cleft palates, and severe developmental delays. Researchers examining marriage records from frontier Texas confirm the trend. In some counties, more than 30% of all marriages before 1900 were between close relatives. Doctors of the era described unusual clusters of inherited conditions, though without modern genetics, they could only call them family curses. These haunting images, preserved in forgotten archives, reveal what words could barely capture: the cost of frontier independence. Geneticist. We now know that conditions like Tay-Sachs, microcephaly, and congenital limb deformities can appear in high frequency when gene pools are closed off. Texas frontier families gave us some of the earliest American case studies of this tragic pattern. The story of Texas is often told as one of rugged independence and boundless land. But for the families trapped in isolation, independence came at a staggering price. Generations born into cycles of suffering that no pioneer spirit could overcome. But even the Texas frontier could not compare to what came next. In the coal mining hills of West Virginia, one family's isolation produced consequences so shocking that once seen, they can never be forgotten. On the Texas frontier, isolation stretched across endless plains. But in the Appalachian mountains, it was the opposite. Families hemmed in by ridges and valleys, their lives dictated by coal and company towns. Here, geography and industry created a different kind of prison, and it raises the question, what happens when generations are trapped not by choice, but by economic survival? For families in the mining towns of West Virginia and Kentucky, escape was nearly impossible, and the genetic consequences are still with us today. In the early 1900s, coal companies carved entire towns into the hollers of Appalachia. Houses, schools, churches, all built by the company, owned by the company, and controlled by the company. A miner was paid in script, could only shop at the company store, and often died owing money back to the very men who owned him. With few outsiders coming in, marriage choices were limited to the families who lived and died under the shadow of the mines. Cousins married cousins, siblings' children married each other, and the family tree turned inward. By the third generation, doctors reported strange clusters of inherited conditions, microcephaly, congenital heart defects, intellectual disabilities. Locals whispered about tainted bloodlines. To the families, they were simply children trying to survive. Historian: coal camps were cages. Once you were born in, you almost never got out. Families intermarried across generations, not because they didn't know the risks, but because there simply weren't other options. Medical surveys conducted in eastern Kentucky during the 1930s found rates of congenital deformities up to 4 times higher than national averages. Some researchers attributed this to environmental toxins, mercury, lead, coal dust, but genetic isolation made the problem even worse. Church records, school rolls, even mining company accident logs reveal the same family names repeating again and again: Collins, Hatfield, Mullins, an endless cycle of kinship that left little room for genetic diversity. Geneticist: when you combine environmental stressors like malnutrition and coal dust exposure with an already shallow gene pool, the results can be catastrophic. These communities are case studies in how poverty and isolation magnify genetic risk. In Appalachia, the cost of coal wasn't just paid underground. It was written into the bodies of children born in company towns, marked by deformities, weakened by disease, bound by a legacy their families could not escape. But what few realized was that far beyond the Appalachian ridges, isolation took on a different form. On the windswept prairies of the Great Plains, families scattered by miles of empty land and bound by culture and faith would discover that solitude on the frontier could be just as dangerous as the coal camps of Appalachia. From the Appalachian hollers, where coal dust and poverty sealed families into genetic cycles, the American story of isolation moves westward, onto the endless grasslands of the Great Plains. But here, the danger wasn't mines or company towns. It was distance itself. Families, scattered for miles across treeless prairies, faced a haunting question. What happens when there's no one else to marry but your kin? The Homestead Act of 1862 promised 160 acres of free land to anyone willing to endure the unforgiving prairie. Thousands of Scandinavian immigrants, German-Russian settlers, and other hopefuls seized the chance. But isolation came at a price. The nearest neighbor might live 20 miles away. Church congregations were small, and within these tightly bound ethnic enclaves, families turned inward, sometimes too far inward. Among Scandinavian families in North Dakota, researchers traced unusually high rates of recessive disorders, ranging from metabolic conditions to severe developmental disabilities. The culprit wasn't ignorance. It was distance. On windswept farms, young men and women had little choice but to marry cousins who lived close enough to court. In German-Russian settlements, religion tightened the circle further. Congregations often forbade marriage outside their faith. The result? Family names repeating across generations, bloodlines folding in on themselves. In some prairie towns, medical records from the early 1900s show clusters of genetic conditions hidden in plain sight. But behind the statistics were families, mothers giving birth to children they could not save, fathers watching sons struggle to walk, daughters trapped in cycles of dependency. Medical journals from the 1920s noted unusually high rates of genetic deafness in certain German-Russian communities. In others, metabolic diseases appeared at several times the national average. Genealogists tracing these families today still find repeating surnames. And genetic counselors in states like Nebraska and Kansas report rare conditions resurfacing in modern descendants. What the Great Plains settlers could not know was that their very independence, their desire to preserve faith, culture, and family, came at a biological cost. The story of the Great Plains homesteaders is a story of survival, families carving life from nothing, but paying a hidden price in their bloodlines. Their legacy remains etched in the genetics of their descendants, a reminder that even freedom on the frontier carried invisible chains. But the hidden dangers of isolation didn't end with genetics. In some of America's most neglected rural pockets, isolation fostered something even darker: generational abuse, secrecy, and families living outside the reach of law and society itself. On the prairies, isolation bred hidden genetic consequences. But sometimes the dangers of isolation cut even deeper, not just into the body, but into the fabric of family itself. What happens when a family is sealed away for generations? Not by geography alone, but by secrecy, neglect, and silence. In Australia, the Colt family shocked the world with their hidden compound. But America has its own dark parallels. Cases that raise haunting questions. How could these families exist in plain sight, and how many more remain unseen? In the hills of rural Appalachia, in forgotten corners of the Ozarks, in backroads America, families were discovered living in conditions so isolated, so neglected, they seemed frozen in time. Neighbors rarely visited, schools never called. Authorities, when they came, were often decades too late. One such case came to light in the early 2000s. A family of nearly 30, spanning 4 generations, lived in near total isolation. Children born into the compound knew nothing of schooling, nothing of the outside world. Their speech was limited, their understanding of life confined to the boundaries of their own neglected homestead. A child welfare investigator recalled, "When we arrived, the silence was almost worse than the conditions. These children didn't know how to speak in full sentences. They had never seen a doctor. It was as though time had stopped." This was more than poverty. It was a cycle of generational abuse, enabled by distance, by stigma, and by the cracks in America's welfare system. Schools never intervened. Churches looked away. Authorities claimed they didn't know. Unlike the Colt family of Australia, these American cases were scattered, hidden in valleys, lost in plains, buried in wooded hollows. But the patterns were the same. Children with no birth certificates, no education, no future. Isolation had become a prison. And in that prison, abuse thrived. Imagine being 12 years old, yet unable to read. Imagine never hearing your own name written down. Never being touched by anyone outside your family. For some, this was not imagination. It was life. These aren't just rumors. Court records detail prosecutions for neglect, abuse, and incest in forgotten towns across the Midwest and South. Investigators documented homes without plumbing, children without shoes, and entire families living off discarded food. A sociologist once observed, "Isolation doesn't just remove access to schools or hospitals, it removes accountability. Without outside eyes, abuse festers unchecked." Genetics played a role, but the greater tragedy was systemic. America's social safety net had holes large enough for entire families to disappear inside. The Colt parallels remind us, isolation can destroy more than bodies. It can erase futures, smother childhoods, and blind entire communities to suffering hidden in plain sight. These families show us that the greatest danger of all is not distance, but silence. But hidden within these disturbing family stories lies something larger, a scientific puzzle. From the hills of Appalachia to the plains of the Midwest, American researchers began asking, how could isolation shape entire populations? And what could these forgotten families teach us about genetics itself? From the shadows of America's most hidden families came questions too big to ignore. Their suffering wasn't only a story of neglect, it was a window into something deeper, something science needed to confront. In the early 20th century, as America entered an age of rapid industrial growth, another, quieter revolution was taking place. Not in factories, but in laboratories and university halls. What could these isolated communities, families scarred by secrecy, geography, and silence, teach researchers about the very building blocks of life? For the first time, the tragedies of individual families became data, numbers, charts, probabilities. But behind every equation was a child, a mother, a story written in blood. American geneticists began to notice patterns. In Kentucky hollers, in Appalachian coal towns, in the far stretches of the prairie, records showed families sharing not only names, but medical conditions passed through generations. At the University of Kentucky in the 1930s, researchers first mapped the family tree of the Fugates, the so-called blue people. What they found wasn't a curiosity. It was a case study in recessive inheritance, proof that geography could trap rare genes within a closed circle. And they weren't alone. Across the Midwest, university studies focused on small farming enclaves, Scandinavian settlers in Minnesota, German-Russian communities in the Dakotas. Here, too, the same names repeated in church logs, marriage licenses, and medical records. These weren't just numbers, they were people. A boy born blind in one county, a girl in another unable to walk, both traced back to the same ancestral line, separated only by time and distance. This led to the development of the inbreeding coefficient, a mathematical model predicting the probability of inheriting identical genes from both parents. For scientists, it was a breakthrough. For families, it was destiny, written in their DNA. The evidence piled up. Medical journals filled with case studies, photos of twisted limbs, faded X-rays of malformed spines, handwritten charts documenting entire communities. Some saw it as an opportunity for medical advancement. Others saw it as exploitation, turning family suffering into academic footnotes. In America's push to understand genetics, isolated communities became both subjects of study and symbols of warning, a living laboratory where the cost of human isolation could be measured. These studies forever changed medicine. They gave doctors tools to predict risk, to understand genetic disorders, and to counsel families about inheritance. But they also carried a darker truth. Knowledge came at the expense of those least able to refuse. The science of genetics in America was built not just on laboratory mice, but on the lives of real families, families whose isolation revealed truths about us all. But if the past is filled with tragedy, the present holds something different: hope. Across America, science, education, and awareness are giving families the tools to break free from cycles of isolation, proving that knowledge can rewrite destiny. After generations of silence, secrecy, and suffering, science finally offered an answer. But answers alone aren't enough. What happens after the diagnosis? Can cycles of isolation and inbreeding truly be broken? Or are families destined to repeat the past? Across America today, hope comes not in the form of secrecy, but in conversation. Genetic counseling programs, once rare, once stigmatized, now provide families with knowledge their ancestors never had. In Kentucky, Dr. Matthew Woods remembers his first encounter with a family still living in rural isolation. They came in with fear, he recalls, but they left with answers and a plan for the future. Educational outreach programs, from Appalachia to the deserts of New Mexico, bring science to communities once cut off by geography and poverty. Mobile health units drive where doctors rarely did before, bringing screenings and hope. Even more powerful are the success stories. Families who, through awareness, broke free from generations of hidden suffering. Children once destined to repeat their parents' fate now sit in classrooms, not hospital beds. Data supports what stories reveal. University studies show that outreach programs in isolated regions reduced incidence of inbred genetic disorders by nearly 40% in just one generation. Clinics in West Virginia, Pennsylvania, and Kentucky now track cases with unprecedented transparency, proving that education and mobility can change the trajectory of entire bloodlines. Perhaps the greatest revelation is this: cycles can end. The story of American inbreeding is not just one of tragedy, but of resilience. Families once hidden in the shadows of neglect and secrecy are stepping into the light of knowledge, and with it, opportunity. The past shows us what happens in silence, but the future shows us what becomes possible when silence is broken, and voices are finally heard.